So there I was, Jake Martinez, sitting in the back row of advanced quantum mechanics at Galactic University, trying not to laugh at my professor's ridiculous accent. Professor Vex Thyra had this habit of pronouncing theoretical like the or et-ika-ikal, while waving all four of her purple arms around like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. And let me tell you, when you have 4 arms, that's a lot of conducting. Galactic University was supposed to be this incredible honor for humanity. Out of 8 billion humans, only 50 got accepted each year to study alongside the galaxy's brightest minds. The campus itself was beautiful. If you ignored the fact that half the buildings floated in mid-air and the other half were underground, because apparently the Malaxians were afraid of sunlight. The library had books that wrote themselves, the cafeteria served food that adjusted its flavor based on your DNA, and the dorms had gravity settings you could adjust like a thermostat. But here's the thing, nobody tells you about being an exchange student at an alien university. You're basically the class pet. The professors smile at you the same way you'd smile at a golden retriever who learned to sit. Sure, it's impressive for a dog, but nobody expects it to understand calculus. Professor Vex Thyra was the worst offender. She taught quantum mechanics like she was explaining finger painting to kindergartners, at least whenever she looked in my direction. The quartzites with their crystalline bodies that literally processed information at light speed. She'd dive into complex mathematical proofs that made my brain hurt. The slug-like Malaxians with their collective consciousness. She'd reference theories I'd never heard of. But me? I got the simplified version with helpful analogies about bouncing balls. Now, as we discussed last week, Vex Thyra announced, her 4 arms already starting their interpretive dance routine. The impossibility theory clearly demonstrates that certain quantum states cannot exist in our universe. This has been established fact for over 200 years. Ever since the great Zephyrian mathematician QLX Norp first proved it. I raised my hand, mostly out of habit. Back on Earth, I'd been that guy who asked too many questions in lecture halls. Apparently, that trait followed me across 17 star systems. Yes, Jake? Vex Thyra sighed, like my question was already interrupting her busy schedule of being superior. I was just wondering, has anyone ever actually tested this theory? Like experimentally? The classroom went dead silent. And I mean dead silent. Even Zerk, the Malaxian who constantly made this weird humming noise through his breathing slits, stopped humming. 23 alien faces turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from confusion to outright horror. Professor Vex Thyra's 4 arms stopped mid-wave. Tested it. Jake, my dear primitive, I mean my dear student, this is established theoretical physics. We don't test theories that have been proven mathematically for centuries. But that's not really how science works, is it? I said, trying to keep my voice casual. I mean, back on Earth, we learned that even Einstein's theories needed experimental verification before. Einstein? Vex Thyra interrupted, and I swear I saw her eye twitch. You're comparing the work of QX Norp, one of the greatest minds in galactic history, to some primitive Earth mathematician? Well, yeah, but... Jake. Her voice had that tone teachers use when they're trying really hard not to lose their patience. Perhaps you should focus on understanding the basic concepts before questioning established galactic science. The thing is, I would have dropped it right there. I really would have. But then Pip, the quartzite sitting next to me, whispered something that sounded like crystal chimes being dropped down a stairwell. And suddenly all the other alien students were making that weird chittering sound that passes for laughter in polite galactic society. And that's when my stubborn human pride kicked in. Professor Vex Thyra, I said, raising my hand again with what I hoped looked like innocent curiosity, could you walk me through QLX Norpsorb's original proof again? I want to make sure I understand the mathematical foundation. She looked at me like I'd just asked her to explain quantum mechanics using sock puppets, but she launched into the explanation anyway. Four arms started drawing equations in the holographic display while she rattled off formulas that would make Stephen Hawking weep with joy. Now, I'm not claiming to be some kind of mathematical genius. My SAT scores were decent, not spectacular. But I had spent the last 6 months at Galactic University attending lectures that were supposedly dumbed down for my primitive human brain. And somewhere during those months I'd developed what you might call a sensitivity to mathematical bull crap. Excuse me, I interrupted about halfway through her explanation, but didn't you just divide by 0 in step 7? Vexthyra's forearms froze mid-gesture. I beg your pardon? In step 7 of the proof, you're dividing the quantum flux coefficient by the probability differential. But according to the parameters you established in step 3, the probability differential equals 0 in a closed system. So you're essentially dividing by 0, which would make the entire proof invalid. The silence in the room was deafening. Zirk had started making a high-pitched whistling sound through his breathing slits, which I'd learned was the Malaxian equivalent of nervous laughter. Pip's crystalline body was flickering between colors so fast it looked like a disco ball having a seizure. "Jake," Professor Vexthyra said slowly, "you're obviously misunderstanding the complex mathematical relationships involved in." "Am I?" I pulled out my tablet and started scribbling equations. Because if we apply basic algebraic principles to your step 7, we get infinity equals negative infinity, which is mathematically impossible. And if the foundation is flawed, then the entire theory collapses. I looked up to find 23 pairs of alien eyes staring at me like I'd just announced I could fly. Professor Vexthyra's face had turned a fascinating shade of purple that I was pretty sure wasn't her normal color. "Furthermore, I continued because apparently my mouth had decided to keep talking without consulting my brain. If you look at the practical applications of impossibility theory, it predicts that quantum tunneling should be impossible at macro scales. But we observe quantum tunneling effects in biological systems all the time. Photosynthesis, for example, or enzyme catalysis. These are macro-scale quantum effects that your theory says can't exist. Those are different phenomena entirely, Vexthyra snapped, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. Are they? Because if we modify the base equation by accounting for temporal quantum fluctuations, I started drawing new equations on my tablet, translating my thoughts into the mathematical notation I'd learned over the past 6 months. We get a result that not only allows for these phenomena but predicts them. By now, other students were pulling out their own tablets, checking my math. The quiet chittering that had started as alien laughter was turning into something else entirely. Something that sounded suspiciously like interest. "This is ridiculous," Vexthyra declared, all 4 arms waving dismissively. "Jake, you're a first-year student from a primitive world that only discovered quantum mechanics 50 years ago. QLX Norp's work has been accepted by every major physicist in the galaxy for over 2 centuries. But has anyone actually tested it?" I asked again. "We don't need to test mathematical proofs. But you do need to test their predictions against reality," I shot back. "That's literally what science is." The bell chimed, ending the class period, but nobody moved. Students were still hunched over their tablets, working through my equations. Professor Vexthyra stood at the front of the room, all 4 arms crossed, looking like she wanted to banish me to the nearest black hole. "Tomorrow," she announced in a voice that could freeze helium, "I will bring in additional resources to properly educate you about established galactic science. Jake, perhaps Dr. Blorgenstein from the Advanced Physics Department can explain concepts that are apparently beyond my ability to convey to primitive minds." She gathered her materials and stalked out of the classroom, leaving behind a room full of very confused alien students and one human who was starting to realize he might have just stepped in something much deeper than he'd intended. Zirk slithered over to me as I packed up my things. "Jake, friend," he said in his wet, whistling voice, "you have made Professor Vexthyra very angry." "Yeah, I noticed that." "This is either very stupid," he continued, "or very interesting. Perhaps both. Great. Just great. You know what's really fun? Trying to research centuries-old galactic physics theories when every single source in the university library starts with the assumption that you're wrong. I spent the first 2 hours of my impromptu, all-nighter getting the same response from every holographic database I accessed: impossibility theory is established fact. For introductory resources suitable for primitive species, please see Basic Physics for Developing Worlds, Section 3.2. Thanks for nothing, alien Google. But here's the thing about being human: we're stupidly persistent. Some alien species are faster than us, stronger than us, smarter than us in raw computational power. But when we get an idea stuck in our heads, we just won't let it go. It's probably the same trait that made our ancestors look at woolly mammoths and think, "I bet I could kill that with a pointy stick." So I dug deeper, way deeper, past the introductory texts, past the standard references, into the dusty corners of the digital archives where research papers went to die. And that's when things got interesting. QLX Norp's original paper from 247 years ago was brilliant, no question about it. The mathematics were elegant, the logic was sound, and the conclusions followed naturally from the premises. There was just one tiny problem: nobody had ever actually tested whether the premises were true. The entire theory was built on something called the universal constant of quantum limitation, which QLX Norp had calculated based on observations of stellar phenomena. Reasonable enough, except that every subsequent physicist had simply accepted this constant as gospel truth. For 2.5 centuries, nobody had thought to double-check the math. I was 3 energy drinks deep into my caffeine-fueled research binge when I stumbled across something that made my brain hurt in the best possible way. A research paper from Dr. Teixeira of the Andromedan Physics Institute, published just 12 years ago, that presented observational data completely contradicting QLX Norp's universal constant. The paper had been published in the Journal of Fringe Physics Theories and promptly ignored by everyone in mainstream academia. Dr. Teixeira's career had apparently ended shortly after publication. But the data was solid. More than solid, it was devastating. Interesting reading. I looked up to find Clocks, one of the maintenance workers, hovering nearby with his cleaning equipment. Clocks was a vegan, which sounds like a dietary choice but is actually a species of 6-limbed, blue-skinned aliens from the Vega system. He was also one of the few beings on campus who treated humans like actual people instead of exotic pets. "You could say that," I replied, rubbing my eyes. "Clocks, can I ask you something? What do you know about Dr. Teixeira?" Clocks's antenna twitched, which was the vegan equivalent of raising an eyebrow. Now that's a name I haven't heard in years. Brilliant physicist, from what I heard. Published some paper that contradicted established theory and got laughed out of academia for it. What happened to him? Clocks corrected. Last I heard, she was working as a theoretical physics consultant for some mining company on Proxima 7. Why do you ask? I showed him my tablet screen, because I think she might have been right. Clocks studied the equations for a long moment. As a maintenance worker, he probably knew more practical physics than most of the students on campus, just from keeping all the advanced technology running. Jake, friend, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you might want to be very careful. Academic politics in this galaxy can get nasty. How nasty? Well, let's just say that Dr. Teixeira wasn't the first physicist to challenge established theory and find herself suddenly unemployable. The Galactic Academic Council takes a dim view of researchers who rock the boat too hard. Great. So not only was I potentially about to humiliate my professor in front of the entire physics department, I might also be destroying my own academic career before it had even started. But you know what? I was already in too deep to back out now. I spent the rest of the night cross-referencing Dr. Teixeira's data with more recent observations, running calculations that made my head spin, and slowly building a case that would either vindicate me or get me expelled from the most prestigious university in the galaxy. By 6 in the morning, I had something that resembled a coherent argument. By 7, I had experimental parameters for tests that could prove or disprove impossibility theory once and for all. By 8, I was seriously considering faking my own death and fleeing to a nice quiet planet where the most complicated physics involved figuring out which end of a hammer to hold. But by 9, when it was time for class, I was walking toward the lecture hall with a presentation that would either change galactic physics forever or confirm that humans really were too stupid for higher education. Sometimes being human means doing incredibly stupid things just to see what happens. Walking into that lecture hall was like walking into a gladiatorial arena. If gladiatorial arenas were filled with curious aliens and the smell of ozone from overcharged holographic projectors. Word had apparently spread overnight about the human who dared question Vex Thyra. Because the room was packed. Students from other departments, professors I'd never seen before, even a few beings I couldn't identify, were crammed into every available seat. Professor Vex Thyra stood at the front of the room looking smug in that special way that only comes from knowing you're about to publicly destroy someone's academic credibility. Next to her stood the most intimidating alien I'd ever seen, Dr. Blorgenstein, head of the Advanced Physics Department, whose tentacled face and massive brain case made him look like someone had crossed an octopus with Einstein and then fed the result nothing but math textbooks for 50 years. Jake, Professor Vex Thyra announced as I walked in, Dr. Blorgenstein has graciously agreed to help clarify some of the more complex concepts that seemed to confuse you yesterday. Dr. Blorgenstein's tentacles writhed in what I hoped was a friendly greeting and not a threat display. Indeed, he said in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed in a blender, Professor Vex Thyra has informed me of your concerns regarding impossibility theory. I thought it might be educational to discuss why certain theories are considered established fact. That's great, I said, setting up my presentation tablet, because I actually prepared a little presentation of my own. The room went dead silent again. Apparently, students weren't supposed to bring their own presentations to what was clearly intended as my public execution. Jake, Vex Thyra said slowly, this isn't really the appropriate forum for. Oh, I think it's the perfect forum, I interrupted, connecting my tablet to the main holographic display. After all, science is supposed to be about open discussion and peer review, right? Dr. Blorgenstein's tentacles stopped moving entirely, which I was starting to realize was the alien equivalent of stunned silence. You prepared a presentation? Well, you know how it is, I said, trying to keep my voice casual while my heart hammered like a jackhammer. I'm just a primitive human. So I figured I should probably do my homework before questioning centuries of established science. My first slide appeared in the holographic display, Impossibility Theory, a critical analysis by Jake Martinez, Primitive Earth Monkey. I heard something that might have been laughter from the back of the room, but it was quickly hushed. So I began. After spending all night in the library, I discovered something interesting. Impossibility theory has never actually been experimentally verified. Not once. Not ever. In 247 years. That's because mathematical proofs don't require experimental verification, Dr. Blorgenstein interjected, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. But the premises do, I replied, clicking to my next slide. QLX Norp's entire theory is built on the universal constant of quantum limitation, which he calculated based on stellar observations made over 2 centuries ago with instruments that we now know were inaccurate by several orders of magnitude. The next slide showed Dr. Thixmila's data, properly formatted and annotated. More recent observations suggest that QLX Norp's constant is off by at least 40%. When we recalculate his equations with the correct values, the holographic display filled with modified equations, each step clearly labeled and explained. I watched Dr. Blorgenstein's tentacles begin moving again, this time in patterns I was pretty sure indicated intense concentration. The corrected mathematics predict that the supposedly impossible quantum states should actually be common in nature. And guess what? They are. My final slide was a compilation of observational data from across the galaxy, quantum tunneling in biological systems, macro-scale quantum coherence in stellar formation, the quantum entanglement effects in hyperspace navigation. All phenomena that impossibility theory said couldn't exist, but that every spacefaring civilization depended on daily. Furthermore, I continued, if we accept that these quantum states are possible, we can derive new predictions about quantum behavior that could revolutionize our understanding of physics. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Dr. Blorgenstein had gone completely still, his massive brain case tilted at an angle that suggested either deep thought or preparation for attack. "This is," he began, then stopped. "Wrong?" I suggested helpfully. "Actually," he said slowly, "it's rather elegant. The mathematics are sound, the logic is consistent, and the observational evidence is compelling." Professor Vex-Thyra made a sound like air escaping from a punctured balloon. "But Dr. Blorgenstein, surely you're not suggesting that this primitive student has somehow found a fundamental flaw in 2 centuries of established physics?" Dr. Blorgenstein finished. "It would appear that's exactly what he's done." And that's when my tablet chimed with an incoming message from the campus physics lab. Preliminary experimental results confirm theoretical predictions. Recommend immediate full-scale testing. Oh, right. I probably should have mentioned that I'd spent part of the night running actual experiments. "Did you just," Dr. Blorgenstein stared at my tablet in disbelief. "Test the theory?" "Yeah, figured somebody should eventually." The room erupted in chaos. You know that moment in movies where everything goes completely insane all at once? Where the music swells, people are shouting, and the camera does that spinning thing that makes everyone dizzy? That was my life for the next 30 minutes. Dr. Blorgenstein was practically vibrating with excitement, his tentacles moving so fast they looked like purple lightning as he recalculated equations in the air. Half the students in the room were frantically taking notes while the other half were sending urgent messages to friends in other departments. Professor Vex-Thyra had turned a shade of purple I was pretty sure wasn't on the normal color spectrum and kept making sounds like a deflating balloon. "The experimental data is conclusive," Dr. Blorgenstein announced to the room, projecting my lab results onto the main display. "Not only has Jake disproven impossibility theory, but his modified equations predict quantum behaviors we've never even considered possible." "But this is impossible," Vex-Thyra protested. "He's a first-year student from a primitive world. He can't have overthrown 2 centuries of established science in a single night." And yet Dr. Blorgenstein replied with what I was learning to recognize as alien amusement, "Here we are." That's when things got really interesting. Other professors started arriving. Dr. Quex-Nala from the Theoretical Mathematics Department, Professor Yith Morn from Applied Physics, Dr. Zex Thiping from Experimental Quantum Mechanics. Apparently word was spreading through the academic community faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Each new arrival went through the same progression: skepticism, confusion, careful examination of the data, and finally, the kind of excited disbelief that only comes from watching your entire field of study get turned upside down by a 20-year-old human with a tablet and too much caffeine. "This has implications for hyperspace navigation," Dr. Quex-Nala was saying, her crystalline form flickering with excited colors. "Not to mention quantum computing applications," added Professor Yith Morn. "The energy generation possibilities alone could revolutionize galactic civilization," Dr. Zex Thiping chimed in. Meanwhile, I was trying to edge toward the door because this was getting way more attention than I'd ever wanted. All I'd done was point out some questionable mathematics. I hadn't intended to start an academic revolution. "Jake," Dr. Blorgenstein called out, stopping my escape attempt. "You realize what this means, don't you? That I'm probably going to fail quantum mechanics?" He made that gravelly sound that passed for laughter among his species. "On the contrary, my young friend, You've just become one of the most important physicists in the galaxy." "I'm not a physicist," I protested. "I'm just a student who asks too many questions." "Those are often the best kind," Professor Yithmorn said. "The established experts become too comfortable with existing theories. It takes an outsider to see the obvious flaws." That's when the campus news drones arrived. 3 floating spheres equipped with cameras and recording equipment buzzed into the lecture hall like metallic bees, immediately focusing on me with their lens arrays. Jake Martinez, one of them, announced in a synthesized voice, "Galactic University News. How does it feel to have revolutionized physics before lunch on a Tuesday?" "Overwhelming?" I suggested. "What's your next research target?" another drone asked. "Which established theory will you debunk next?" "I don't actually have a plan to debunk theories," I said. "I just wanted to understand quantum mechanics." "And in the process of understanding," Dr. Blorgenstein interjected, "you've shown us that our understanding was fundamentally flawed. The mark of true scientific insight." Professor Vex Thyra, who had been quietly hyperventilating in the corner, finally spoke up. "But what about my career? My reputation? I've been teaching impossibility theory for 30 years. The room went quiet. This was the awkward part nobody wanted to address. When a fundamental theory gets overturned, it doesn't just change textbooks. It destroys careers, invalidates decades of research, and forces entire departments to reconsider everything they thought they knew. "Professor Vex Thyra," I said carefully, "just because the theory was wrong doesn't mean your work was worthless. You taught me enough about quantum mechanics that I could recognize the flaws in the first place. And now that we know where the problems are, think about how much new research becomes possible." Dr. Blorgenstein's tentacles curled in what I'd learned was a sign of approval. "The young human is correct. This isn't the end of physics, Vex Thyra. It's a new beginning. Besides," I added, "I'm going to need a lot of help understanding what comes next. I may have stumbled onto something big, but I'm still just a first-year student who doesn't know what he's doing." And that's how I accidentally became the most famous undergraduate in galactic history while trying to figure out why my professor's math didn't add up. 3 months later, I was standing in front of another packed lecture hall, but this time I was the one behind the podium. The University of Proxima Centauri had invited me to give a guest lecture on the human method, applied skepticism in theoretical physics, which was a fancy way of saying how to question everything your professors tell you without getting expelled. The lecture hall was filled with students from 17 different worlds, all eager to hear from the human who had accidentally revolutionized galactic physics. In the front row sat Dr. Thex Mila, who had been reinstated as a full professor after 12 years in academic exile. Turns out, when you're proven spectacularly right, universities are very eager to forgive and forget. The key to the human method, I was explaining to the audience, isn't being smarter than everyone else. Trust me, I'm definitely not smarter than everyone else. The key is being willing to ask the stupid questions. A student in the third row, some kind of floating gas cloud with tentacles, raised what I assumed was a hand. "But how do you distinguish between productively stupid questions and just stupid questions?" "Great question," I replied. "The answer is you don't. You ask them all and let the evidence sort it out. The whole point is that you can't know which questions are worth asking until you ask them." It was weird being on the other side of the podium, but also kind of exciting. Over the past 3 months, I'd watched as my accidental discovery rippled through the academic community. Universities across the galaxy had started encouraging students to challenge established theories. Research departments were revisiting centuries-old assumptions. The human method of questioning everything had become the hottest trend in galactic education. Not everyone was happy about it. The Galactic Academic Council had issued several strongly worded statements about maintaining respect for established scientific authority. Some of the older, more traditional professors complained that students were becoming improperly inquisitive. But the results spoke for themselves. In just 3 months, researchers had identified flaws in dozens of accepted theories, leading to breakthrough discoveries in everything from quantum mechanics to xenobiology. After my lecture, I found Professor Vexthyra waiting outside the hall. She'd become my research partner after swallowing her considerable pride and admitting that maybe, possibly, that humans might have something valuable to contribute to galactic science after all. "Good lecture, Jake," she said, all 4 arms crossed, but in a way that seemed more thoughtful than annoyed. "Though I still think you could have been a bit more diplomatic about the questioning authority part." "Hey, I said it nicely," I protested. "I could have called it how your professors are probably wrong about everything." "Please don't give the news drones any more headline ideas." We walked together toward the campus shuttle station, past groups of students engaged in animated discussions about theoretical physics. It was gratifying to see young minds getting excited about science, but even if half of them were probably plotting to overthrow some other established theory just to see what would happen. "Vexthyra, can I ask you something?" I said as we waited for the shuttle. "Do you ever wonder how many other theories are just accepted without testing? How much of what we think we know is actually wrong?" She considered this for a long moment, her 4 arms gesturing in patterns that I'd learned indicated deep thought. "That," she said finally, "is both a terrifying and exhilarating question." "Yeah, it keeps me up at night sometimes." "Jake, you realize that you've essentially made it impossible for anyone in galactic academia to ever feel completely confident about established facts again?" "Sorry about that." "Don't be sorry," she said as our shuttle arrived. "Be proud. You've reminded us all that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we assumed. Even after centuries of study, we still have so much to learn." As we boarded the shuttle back to Galactic University, I reflected on how my life had changed. 3 months ago, I was just another human exchange student trying not to embarrass my entire species. Now I was accidentally famous, unintentionally influential, and still trying to figure out if I actually understood quantum mechanics or if I'd just gotten really lucky. But that's the thing about being human. We don't always know what we're doing, but we're too stubborn to let that stop us. We ask the questions that seem obvious to us and impossible to everyone else. We challenge assumptions that have been accepted for centuries just because nobody thought to double-check the math. Sometimes that gets us into trouble. Sometimes it gets us thrown out of prestigious universities or laughed out of academic conferences. But sometimes, just sometimes, it changes everything. And as I settled into my shuttle seat, heading back to campus for another day of classes where I was still just trying to pass my exams, I couldn't help but smile. After all, there were probably dozens of other established theories just waiting for some human to ask the right stupid question. The universe was full of possibilities, and I was just getting started.